Alright, so this is one of the last podcasts of the semester. In fact, it's the second last. We'll look at use the things that we've learned this semester to understand a series of developing countries that are called less developed and newly industrializing countries. So let's take a look. We'll look at NICs, LDCs, the matrix of freedom and equality. Then we'll look at the important role and the influence of imperialism and colonialism on the so-called developing world. And then we'll look at post-imperialism and development. So we'll look at the challenges that have befallen the countries in the developing world as a result of post-colonialism, post-imperialism. And we'll notice that some have met these challenges quite well, while others have met them very poorly. Okay, so the first thing to notice is we'll go. Remember the Pritchett reading where it was called Divergence Big Time. Essentially, what the reading was about was it showed that despite the fact that as of I think it was 1871 was where he went back to. In 1871, there was a series of countries that Pritchett looked at that was very different in terms of its level of economic development. Some countries, in fact, I think the richest country per capita GDP, gross domestic product at that time, was Australia. Other countries, such as Japan, were 5 or 6 times poorer on the basis of an estimated GDP per capita than was Australia at that time. And there was a range from Japan, I think was the poorest of that group, to Australia, and there was a range. Now, what's interesting about that is that over time, those countries from different parts of the world, generally, have converged to become the so-called developing world, or the developed world, rather, the advanced industrial democracies. And so what we've noticed is we've noticed a convergence over time amongst this set of countries. Now, simultaneously, though, these countries that have converged over time, they've collectively, as a group, diverged from the rest of the developing world. And so there was a tendency to sort of dichotomize the world into the developed world, particularly after post-communism, colonialism, and the developed world and the developing world. Now, since the 1950s, since the end of colonialism, the end of the Second World War, the end of imperialism, for the most part, raw, brutal imperialism, that is, the so-called developing world has, in fact, broken up into 2 different groups. And these groups are newly industrializing countries, okay, NICs, and these countries are generally characterized by rapid economic growth and also a tendency toward democratization, things like political and social stabilities. So which countries are in this group of NICs? Well, many Latin American countries, Asian countries, obviously the Asian tigers like Thailand, South Korea, and Taiwan particularly, and countries like China now. And then the other group of countries, so this group of newly industrializing countries has been catching up to the already developed world. As I said, both in terms of economic growth, in terms of well-being, and also in terms of things like democratization and political and social stability. There is a group, though, of countries, however, called less developed countries, which haven't been doing very well. And these countries are characterized by lack of economic development and political institutionalization, often economic stagnation or even decline. And some of these have widespread poverty, violence, and civil conflict. So most of Africa is in this is in this group. Some parts of Southeast Asia, some parts of South Asia, like Pakistan, and the Middle East, for instance. Now, so why is it that some of these countries have been able to become NICs while others have continued to be very less developed? Okay, so the matrix of freedom and equality, while NICs and LDCs are becoming increasingly dissimilar, as I mentioned before, they still do share relative weaknesses in both freedom and equality. Okay, and so what is the cause of this lack of freedom and equality? Well, there's really no consensus among social scientists, economists, political scientists, etc. But many point to the historical role of imperialism and colonialism, and the role that that has played on these societies. So let's take a look at this. Let's not worry about that. So what is imperialism and colonialism? Okay, we won't worry about that. There is a distinction, so it's important that you know that. But here's a timeline of modern imperialism. Now what you'll notice here that's important is that by about by about 1825 or so, wars of independence in Latin America have brought Spanish and Portuguese rule to an end. So Latin America was decolonized almost 200 years ago. Now, of course, as we know, decolonization in much of the developing world, though, really only starts to take place after 1947, and then really hits full swing in the 50s and the 60s. Okay. Interestingly, it was only in 1975, after the collapse of the military dictatorship in Portugal, that Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia became independent. Okay. So what are some of the institutions of imperialism? Well, there's the state, right? Political and social institutions, ethnicity that we've talked about, and then also gender is important. Now the state, right, as a form of political organization, as we know, really began in Europe, and it was imposed, it was exported around the world, imposed around much of the world outside of Europe by European imperialists. Now, what's interesting is that the borders that were drawn by these imperial states, they often reflected the relative powers of the imperial powers, such as France, Great Britain, etc., rather than existing geographic, religious, or even linguistic realities. So what we find is that in many in many places around the world, there was an international or a state border, or a imperial boundary drawn that cut across religious or ethnic or even clan lines, so that you had members of one clan ruled by one empire and members of another clan ruled by another, and that has continued to this day, where you have members of a singular ethnic group living in two or more states. Typical example, of course, is the Kurds in the Middle East, who live currently in 4 different states. Now, the Kurds have never achieved statehood, but this is an example of the drawing of boundaries that didn't make any sort of sense socially from the perspective of those living there. It made sense rather from the extant political realities of the time. And what happened is that the state essentially replaced and eroded traditional institutions. Okay. So local religions, maybe local customs. Okay. The society. Now this has the society, of course, is strong in and of itself, and in many cases, in particular in Africa, has been able to withstand the complete subordination or imposition of the state on social practices. Okay, and it provides a constant and legitimate source of resistance to state power, and we find this all over Africa, where the state, rather than being too strong, is in many cases much too weak. Okay. What about national and ethnic identities? Well, some of these were imposed on the subjugated peoples by their colonial masters. We know the story of Rwanda, where Tutsi and the Hutus, who are currently two distinct ethnic groups, were really one ethnic group 150 years ago, but as a result of Dutch and Belgian colonialism and the choices made by imperial masters, small differences in